You are listening to the IFH Podcast Network. For more amazing filmmaking and screenwriting podcasts, just go to ifhpodcastnetwork.com.
Welcome to the Successful Screenwriter Podcast, where we discuss anything and everything screenwriting. Here we interview successful screenwriters and filmmakers to find out just what it takes to make it in the industry. Just a heads up, this episode is brought to you by my book, The Guide for Every Screenwriter, which has been listed as one of the best screenwriting books of all time by the Book Authority. If you're looking for something that reveals the secrets of screenwriting in an easy to understand and engaging way, then this is the book for you. You can find The Guide for Every Screenwriter at thesuccessfulscreenwriter.com/books. Now, on to the show. Okay, welcome to the podcast. We have on Hollywood Television Global Ambassador of Film. He's earned 15 Emmys, 2 Peabodys, an Academy Award. He was a founding member of the AFI. That's the American Film Institute, by the way. He's got a new book out called My Place in the Sun. This is George Stevens Jr. Thank you for being with us.
A great pleasure, Geoffrey.
Yeah, I'm honored to have you. So, I mean, you have had a career in the industry for a long time, and you helped really influence it in so many different ways. I was excited to have you on the show and kind of talk about how that industry has changed and maybe even where you think it's going. Before we get into that, though, I'd love to get a little bit of your origin story that led you towards this amazing career.
Well, I guess I was born in the Hollywood Hospital, which was a good indicator or opportunity. And I don't know how many of your viewers and listeners know, but my father was an exceptional film director, George Stevens, who made everything from Alice Adams and Swing Time in the 30s and Gunga Din.
Wow.
Through Shane and Giant and A Place in the Sun, The Diary of Anne Frank and The Greatest Story Ever Told. After the war, he had a significant war career heading combat photography for 3 years in Europe. And I was influenced by my father. I spent the early part of my life in my beginning of my career kind of figuring that my best shot was to devote my life to ending up being the second best film director in my family. But life took some twists and turns, and I did do some directing, but I did a lot of other stuff.
Yeah.
And the kind of the shape of my life story was that I went to work for my father. The first job I had out of high school, I had no job in the summer, and he gave me a job.
Yeah.
I had 2 things to do. One was to break down Theodore Dreiser's An American Tragedy into a notebook. Every incident, every character.
Wow.
Because he was about to start the screenplay of A Place in the Sun, which was based on Theodore Dreiser's An American Tragedy. And of course, went on to win his first Academy Award with that. And the other part of the job was to read the stuff that came over from Paramount, from the studio, novels, screenplays.
Yeah.
And not all of it was very alluring to a 17-year-old on hot summer days. but one afternoon, a book arrived, a small book, and I picked it up and I read it in an afternoon. And I went to see my dad that night, and he was in bed reading. And I had the book in my hand, and I walked in and I said, "Dad," I read this book, and I think it's really a good story, and I think you ought to read it. And I remember he looked at me and he said, "Why don't you tell me the story?"
Oh, that's cool.
So I found myself pacing around his bed, trying to recollect and make interesting the story Shane.
Oh, wow.
And that not only became his next movie, but it became my first job on location, um, uh, working on that historic Western.
I love that he had you pitch it to him.
Yeah. Well, I
That's
mean,
awesome.
and it turns out that, looking back, that this make work job was his way of exposing me to whether I was interested in and whether I had an aptitude
That's cool.
for, and just to connect it, because I mentioned the Oscar for A Place in the Sun, which that I went to the Academy Awards that night. He'd just come back from the war, or back from the war a couple of years.
Okay.
And I went with my mother and my grandmother. His mother was an actress, Georgie Cooper, and his father, Lander Stevens. They were great figures in the theater in San Francisco. And I sat with my dad and Joseph L. Mankiewicz. This is a screenwriting program.
Oh my God, Mank.
That's it. Mank came out
Wow.
to present the award for Best Director. And the nominees were John Huston for African Queen, William Wyler for The Desperate Hours, Vincent Minnelli for An American in Paris, Elia Kazan for Streetcar Named Desire, and George Stevens for A Place in the Sun. Well, Mankiewicz recited the name George Stevens, and Dad accepted the award. And it was,
That's cool.
and driving home, he was driving the car,
Yeah.
and the Oscar was on the seat between us. And, I think I was around 17 at the time. And, it was a pretty exciting night.
Yeah, that's cool.
Maybe he thought I was too excited or I was getting the wrong idea. But I never forget, he looked over at me and kind of smiled, and he said, we'll have a better idea what kind of a film this is in about 25 years.
Wow.
But this is before videotape, before DVDs, before streaming. And he had this sense that a film's real worth was how it lasted with the audience. And this idea of the test of time. And how would one know that one day I would find myself founding the American Film Institute to preserve the great films and start the Life Achievement Award of the AFI to recognize filmmakers whose work had stood the test of time.
It's amazing. I mean, that is so insightful. And I mean, what do you think is that special something about a film that can stand the test of time?
I think it comes to what is maybe the most important thing I learned working with my father, sitting in the editing room on A Place in the Sun and Giant and Jane and The Diary of Anne Frank. In those days, the studio heads, the studios ran everything then. And the idea was that the audience had the intelligence of 14-year-olds.
Okay.
Don't get, and my father had a very different perspective. And I think it's what marked his films, and in a way it certainly marked my work. Yeah. And that is respect for the audience. He believed that the audience did have insight and awareness. And he always felt that you have to leave something to do for the audience.
Interesting.
Make them bring something to the screen. And I think that's, I think the films that really last all have that quality.
It kind of makes the audience invested and brings them part of like that journey.
And it gives them satisfaction. The audience is going to learn about themselves, and you're seeking some kind of discovery. Even in a Laurel and Hardy film, of human nature and what life is about.
There's definitely a generational quality that comes along with these really great films that are almost kind of like their own sense of Americana. where you see younger generations of kids now watching films that should be long dead, but
Yeah.
are still coming in, and almost like music. Like my kid listens to, old 70s classic rock, but yet he's a 15-year-old kid. And so there's this sense of it can surpass the generations, which I think is fascinating.
Yeah, it's so important. And here, when he said that film, what it's going to be like in 25 years, I don't even think he imagined
Yeah.
that A Place in the Sun would having a new Blu-ray edition on its 70th anniversary
It's
this year.
wild. That's amazing.
70 years. And if you watch A Place in the Sun, it takes you along, as well as any film today.
Yeah, it has that takes you on that emotional journey. Now, a lot of directors, I don't want to say a lot, I would say some directors they don't consider themselves screenwriters. They have a vision for a film, they have a vision for a project, they come on and they provide that vision. Now, other directors, they have a strong screenwriting background, and I want to kind of get your sense on that.
Well, I think you describe it succinctly. Since we're talking about my father, he only took screenplay credit on I think a couple of films, but he was always involved in the screenplay. Even at RKO and Alice Adams, they give you a screenplay and he brings it in another writer.
Okay.
And they shape it, and Katharine Hepburn comes into it and he works with her on it.
Okay.
And so I think, and David Lean wasn't credited on screenplays, but he was very involved in the storytelling. And, today, more of the directors of that ilk are taking credit for their work on the screenplay. Yeah. And then there are others who are very talented at taking a certain piece of work and just making it work and doing the very best with it, but have less to do with actually the architecture of the screenplay. Does that jive with your thinking?
I think it does. I think certain directors, they can really elevate a script visually, and they can really tell that story. And then you have other directors that it's almost like you have to kind of crack the code, and they can get in there and they can make it happen. As a director yourself, and you're so humble, and I really appreciate the insight and on your father, but I want to talk to you. I mean, you've got your own legend here. So as a director, as a writer, what really attracted you to a script? What really attracted you to a project? I mean, work is work. We all like to work, but what did you find in a story that really pulled you into it and you're like, I need to be a part of this project?
Good question. We'll talk about two miniseries. I've made two miniseries.
Okay.
In my life. Both of them won the Emmy for outstanding miniseries.
Awesome.
To disabuse people of your charge that I'm very modest.
Congratulations.
But they attracted me, and I will say what the stories are. But in thinking about your question, first of all, they interested me as stories, but they were both part of history, and they both had themes of justice and injustice that attracted me. And the first was, there's a famous case, or somewhat famous case in Georgia in the 1915 called the Leo Frank case, and it was about a Jewish fellow from New York who'd moved to Georgia and was running a factory, and there was a murder of a young factory worker, and he was essentially framed, and there was a trial, and he was convicted. Had undertones of anti-Semitism, and he was sentenced to prison, and eventually pardoned by the governor, and then Lynch. That's but
Wow.
it's been written about, and it was really good. And a director friend, Billy Hale, we took it on together, and we did the research and brought in Larry McMurtry. And Larry wrote the first draft of the screenplay, and through a lot of complications with networks, they put it aside. Then we came back later and made it into a mini series. It was called The Murder of Mary Fagan, and starred Jack Lemmon and Peter Gallagher and
That's a good cast.
Stacey and Cynthia Nixon and a lot of fine actors. And so that was just a theme, and it turned out to be very successful. And people connected with this idea of, injustice, and it was very well received.
Can I ask you something to build off of that?
Yeah.
So, art imitates life, but I also feel that art influences life, especially film. I feel that films can really influence our culture, or at least reflect the culture that's happening right now. So when you made that miniseries, was it timely as far as the culture was around that specific type of justice versus injustice and anti-Semitism?
Yes, I think it was. I think it is. It would always be timely.
Okay.
And what we were talking about earlier, I think audiences, watch a story like that, and it was, if I do say so, it was presented with some subtlety, and
yeah,
it wasn't black and white, and you weren't quite sure where it was going.
So it made people think.
Exactly, made people figure out, and I think, it kind of raises their consciousness about their own, the prejudices we all have of one sort or another. And the next was, I read about the famed Supreme Court case, Brown versus the Board of Education, which was outlawed for the first time racial segregation in schools.
Right.
And Thurgood Marshall was at the center of that, and I was acquainted with Thurgood Marshall, and I thought this could be a really wonderful story. He was the lawyer who pursued the case. He headed the legal defense fund at the time, and in that case, and now I happened to write the screenplay as I proposed it to CBS as a miniseries.
Yeah.
A wonderful guy named Bill Self, who was the head of that department, said, "Well, that's a great story." He said, "But I don't think you can cast it. Who would you cast?" And, basically saying, is there an African American who can carry 2 nights of television on CBS? And I said, well, I hadn't really started there, but if you ask, I said, I guess I would think of Sidney Poitier.
Oh, he's brilliant.
And he kind of smiled ruefully and said, we've been going after Sidney for 10 years trying to get him. He just won't do television. He said, if you can say that Sidney Poitier will read a script, we'll finance it.
Wow.
So next afternoon, I drove up to Cove Drive and stopped by to see Sidney, who was a friend, and talked about it and told him the story, which is very dramatic.
Yeah.
And not familiar to most people, the drama of it. And Sidney, in that kind of princely way of his, he said, if you come to me with the script and that I find compelling, I will do it. And so I felt great. And there was an actor strike going on, just starting.
No pressure on that. No pressure on that script.
Writer's strike.
There's a writer's strike. Okay.
So it led me, then I discovered that I couldn't go, if I went back to CBS, I'd have to wait till the writer's strike's over. If I wrote it myself, I could start, as an independent person.
Yeah.
And so I wrote the screenplay.
Wow.
And I sent it to Sidney, and Sidney's agent called me first. And he said, Sidney's going to call you tomorrow, but you must have written that. You must have written a hell of a script,
Aw.
because he's been turning down these scripts for years. And of course, Sydney wanted to do it. And then I had another problem that the Supreme Court part of the case, which is only part of it, but the opposing lawyer was John W. Davis, America's greatest lawyer. And so it was Sydney Thurgood arguing against John W., America's lawyer.
Yeah.
And so then I realized that you can't just get a good character actor to play the other lawyer, because if the audience sees this character actor playing it, they say, well, Sydney's going to win because he's a star. And I was down and I hadn't figured out how to cast it. And I was down in South Carolina getting ready to start shooting. And that part didn't start shooting till the latter part of the picture. And so I sent it to Burt Lancaster, who I knew believed in good things. Bert's Ben Benjamin called me and said, you must have a hell of a script. Bert wants to do it. And I'm not going to be difficult about money. Anyway,
wow.
But again, this story, and I really want to kind of get it back in circulation, because it is so telling today, about what the Black people endured, the heroics of the case, the importance of law.
Yeah.
And that he used the law as a weapon to undo this awful segregation that was so much a part of our lives. And again, you say about things, that would be contemporary today, because we're dealing with the same thing.
No, that makes total sense. It's essentially timeless, because you're dealing with these themes, and then you're using the historic injustice. It makes total sense, and I love the fact that you're able to really find something that's important to you and create such a compelling story that you're able to almost do the impossible by bringing all these people together. I mean, the fact that, and I want to ask you about this, because the industry's changed so much. Like,
you have to, I know you want to get to that. Do you just have 60 seconds for the third cushion of that shot?
I have more than that. Hit me.
Okay. I'm having 7 years later, after this big success, I'm having dinner with Sydney and his wife, Joanna, and my wife, Elizabeth, on Sunset Boulevard at a little restaurant. And we sit down, and the women sit on the banquette, and Sydney and I sit next to one another. And, kind of sit down. And and I say to Sydney, well, what are you up to? And Sydney, again, with that, he became more serious than I expected. He said, it has been 40 years since I did Raisin in the Sun on Broadway. He said, I want to go back to Broadway.
Oh, wow.
And I don't know where it came from, but I said, well, how about I write a play about Thurgood Marshall? And Sydney lit up, and he said, that would be great. Well, I'm going to go right through this quickly, but and so Sydney read the script, loved it, and we started working on it. And when we both had apartments at the Sierra Towers there in Los Angeles, and he'd come down to my apartment and he'd read it. And then one day he moved out and he went up to his house in Beverly Hills, where he had a room where he was going to learn the play. And they invited me up to lunch a few months later, and he said, I can't learn your play. I'm 75 years old. I can't learn your play. So the boulder was at the bottom of the hill. And then actually 2 more cushions on the shot. Bill Haber decided to produce it. And we took it to Westport, Connecticut with James Earl Jones, the other great African-American actor who played Thurgood Marshall. And James Earl did it, but he had difficulty learning it and was not comfortable. It was very well received going to Broadway with it. So again, the boulder was at the bottom of the hill. But then we found Lawrence Fishburne. and Lawrence Fishburne did it, and it was a great success on Broadway, and he was wonderful as Thurgood.
Wow. That's it. I can only imagine the type of, I mean, I'm 43 years old, and I don't know if I can memorize all the lines for a play. So I have so much respect for stage actors to be able to do that.
Yeah.
Um,
And just in James Earl's behalf, he went on and continues to do work in the stage. It's just that alone on the stage.
yeah.
He's done a lot of plays, and with working with somebody, it's fine.
Yeah, because you can. Yeah, that makes sense. You can get that energy and play off of them. So what I wanted to hit on was you mentioned how Sidney Poitier didn't want to do television, and back then nobody really wanted to do television. But now everybody wants to do television. It's almost like television is the new golden age. I was just wondering if I could kind of, get your take on the genesis of that, or how you feel about it.
In a large part because of COVID. It might have been coming to a degree anyway, but certainly we became and streaming, streaming without commercials, but always the burden of doing these miniseries that I love doing was the commercials, and you hated to subject the audience to that. I did get General Motors to sponsor Separate but Equal, so there were very many fewer of them.
Gotcha.
But where can you do good work? And you just see so many very good directors are now willing to work in television where they wouldn't before.
Yeah.
And it also creates an opportunity for long form, like those two pieces I did would have been wonderful for streaming without commercials. So I think it's sort of the natural order of things that, and combine that with the fact that theaters have had this horrendous period.
Yeah.
Audiences have not been going to theaters.
Yeah, so the big screen is getting smaller, essentially.
Right. And our home screens are getting larger.
That's awesome. All right. George, do you have any advice before I let you go? Because I know you got to get out of here. Do you have any advice for screenwriters or directors out there, filmmakers out there that you want to pass along?
Probably the most valuable advice is just to believe in yourself, keep trying. I've never done anything of real excellence that somebody hadn't said no to in one way or another.
Right.
And sometimes the hardest part of it is getting to the starting gate.
Yeah.
And it just takes such will. And also, you also need to be a bit of a good listener, not too much of a good listener so that your ideas get washed away. But sometimes you've got to kind of scope out the territory in order to find the place where your particular film will work.
Gotcha. Do you have, is there anything I didn't ask you that I should have before I let you go?
I think it's been a terrific conversation.
Oh, thank you.
My book is rather ambitious and covers a lot of different ground. An important part of my life was, after going to Washington to start the American Film Institute, I had an interest in politics and political candidates and the Kennedy Center Honors, which I started. So there's more to talk about, but I think this has been a very good bite of the apple for me.
And the book is My Place in the Sun. Is the book out already?
No, it's coming out in May or in April. It's called My Place in the Sun, Life in the Golden Age of Hollywood and Washington.
Hey, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter by using my handle @ScreenwriterPod. And if you liked the show, please support it by subscribing and sharing the episode on your social media.